and adoption of the Global Compact for Migration and for the newly established UN Network on Migration. He was also the focal point for Asia and the Middle East in the Labor Migration branch. I now request Mr. Nair to kindly take over the platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Parul. Can you see me and hear me like we always have to ask in every webinar at the beginning? Can you hear me? Nod if you can. Very good. Excellent. Wow, what a pleasure and what a great couple of hours we are going to have in the next set of conversations. Really one that I have been looking forward to for a long time. Ladies and gentlemen, scholars, policymakers, doctoral fellows, and everybody else out there. I know that we have quite a few representatives from civil society organizations, trade unions, employers organizations, a whole range of stakeholders out there, apart from the academics themselves who have also joined us in this conversation. So pleasure, welcome everybody. Thanks, Parul, for that introduction, appreciate it. Let me also perhaps start by thanking the three big organizers who have come together, the three big networks who have come together to put this together. Migrant Forum Asia, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, GRFDT, and CCRM, the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants. These are the three entities that came together. This is the first of three webinars that these three entities are going to be putting together. And where better to start this conversation than in the context of global and regional migration governance, particularly in the time that we are in now, the current circumstances that we are going through, and what migrants in particular are left in terms of the vulnerable situations that they are in. Now, within this context, I've been wondering, how do you start an introduction when you have a panel of 7 eminent speakers, not just speakers, but also in the thought thinkers that they have in driving issues right from global to regional to national levels. Now, when we have such people, how do I start a conversation on global and regional migration governance? So I let them, the experts, really take this up to the fore. A lot of the conversations have moved over the many years now. You know, when we talk about migration governance at the global level, perhaps the first conversations that we heard about migration at the global level was in the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development in 1991, the 94 Plan of Action, the Cairo Plan of Action of the ICPD. That was where the beginnings came. Of course, prior to that, there were ILO legal frameworks. There was the UN Convention on Migrant Workers. There was a whole range of standards. But at the policy level, policymakers really got into it since then. Now, come 2018, we have seen since 1994's ICPD, we have seen a whole range of things happen. We've seen the Global Commission for Migration in the early 2000s. Going from there, we had the first UN high-level dialogue on migration. We then had a whole range of global forum on migration and development. In fact, the current chair of the GFMD is the government of UAE. Apart from the GFMD, we had the SDGs being adopted in 2015. Really 193 member states of the United Nations all coming together and unanimously adopting the SDGs with a whole range of perspectives there. And then, of course, the Global Compact for Migration playing a pivotal role in its being adopted in 2018. So a whole range of global governance scenarios. How do you translate that to the regional level? Number of regional consultative processes, intergovernmental organizations at the regional level discussing it. We have in Asia, for instance, we have SAARC, we have ASEAN discussing migration. And then we have RCPs like the Abu Dhabi Dialogue, the Colombo process, the Bali process. We also have examples from the Middle East, Africa, the Americas, Europe, and so on, where there has been so many such discussions at the regional level. So really to put all of this together for us over the next 2 hours in terms of what I would think is perhaps the best of the best who will bring this to your ears and to help share their knowledge with us. So let's take this forward by perhaps inviting the first person who will set the stage for us. And that person would be Professor Nicola Piper, who doesn't need any introduction. And I'm not going to be really spending a lot of time on introductions. Perhaps just as a simple rule for everybody, please turn your videos off. Please turn your microphones off. Keep them muted so that we really have a session which does not disturb the speakers, and so that we can listen to them clearly. Thank you very much, Nicola.
Yeah.
You have the microphone, not the floor anymore. The microphone.
Not the floor.
Go ahead.
So first question, can you hear and can you see me? You can hear me. Excellent. Thank you so much, Chair, for your kind introduction. It's an absolute great honor to be given the opportunity to contribute to this very exciting webinar, with a few thoughts alongside, a fantastic lineup of speakers. And I'm particularly excited about this particular topic because I've been able to take the observer role in a number of global fora and processes over the last 20 years, including negotiations of, various global instruments and so forth, and also doing this as somebody who always has in mind the reality of specific migration corridors which occur within and across regions. Now, I've been tasked to use my 7.5 minutes to stick to the global level of governance and leave the regional to my fellow panelists. And I should also say right from the outset, I restrict my comments to the governance of labor migration, which rightly or wrongly involves quite different migration regimes than that for refugees. And I suppose by governance, we usually refer to efforts made collectively by governments around the world to tackle a global challenge such as migration by, designing and cooperating on developing a coordinated institutional response to migration, and very often with the assistance of international organizations. And overall, as it stands right now, I personally would say, a broad brush argument that although we have come a long way in terms of achieving a deeper understanding of what migration entails, from everyone's perspective involved, including migrants, in political and institutional terms, we still have, unfortunately, a dysfunctional global migration governance system. And this malfunctioning character or state of affairs has been exposed loud and clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, to flesh this out in the remaining few minutes I have, I'm going to say a few words about 3 aspects of global migration governance: the what, the how, and by whom. So on the issue of what is being governed, I'm referring here to specific governance projects, if you like, a project. And key here is the project is the management of migration. So we really have an economic and securitization approach subsumed under the management of migration discourse, which clearly trumps over the human rights and labor rights-based approach to migration. Now, this discourse is reflected in policies practiced around the world, highly restrictive, highly selective migration policies. And the rights-based approach is, of course, rooted in existing normative framework, which is actually sound and comprehensive if those norms were widely ratified and implemented, which they are not. So the takeaway message here is migration management trumps over the rights-based approach to migration, and this is reflected in, number 1 priority being given to the regulation of people movement, border control, return migration, to the detriment of paying more attention to what happens and occurs at the workplace. So the governance of the workplace unfortunately takes the backseat. Now, the how is migration being governed? Now, it sort of relates back to what the chair already said in his introductory remarks. Since the 1990s, migration has been governed mostly via non-binding instruments and guidelines, and no longer by binding human rights and labor rights frameworks, apart from a few exceptions, of course. It's never completely black and white. And we can see this clearly in the under-ratification of migrant worker-specific conventions, those countries which see themselves mostly as destination countries and located in the global north. But there's also, of course, lacking implementation by those countries which have ratified. And this raises, amongst many other issues, the question of whether we see the right rights being addressed. And what do I mean by this? You know, for migrants, there are enormous barriers put in place to, you know, in terms of, for example, the temporary contract migrants to seek justice, to organize themselves politically and so forth. There's also great resistance to give undocumented and irregular migrants any kind of rights. So we see immigration authorities step in and detain and deport undocumented migrant workers before labor disputes are getting settled. And, you know, I could go into more detail. We leave this for later. The key here is we need a firewall in place. And the Global Compact for Migration, actually in its zero draft, did have such a clause included. But as it so happens, you know, many influential countries in the world were utterly against it, and out it went. The other point I quickly wanted to make is because, you know, many of you work or live or, you know, are based in Asia, the preferred mode of governance in Asia is still on, you know, a bilateral basis. So a lot of bilateral labor agreements, they are notoriously difficult to negotiate for countries of origin, and unsurprisingly also rarely contain any clauses on rights. Thirdly, a couple of words on by whom. Who governs? Who are the key institutional actors? Now, in the sphere of global migration governance, we hear a lot about certain, you know, international organizations playing an important role, and some more than others. And again, here I would say, based on what I've already said, the ILO being the key standard setting organization in the area of labor and employment, it finds itself, unfortunately, somewhat sidelined, and the center stage is taken by the IOM. There are many dedicated staff in both organizations, including the IOM, whose hearts are in absolutely the right places. But the point here is the terms, the ethos and manner of operating of both organizations is fundamentally different, as advocacy organizations and unions among you, you know, are fully aware of. But what is even more important, we have to remind ourselves who the key constituents of international organizations are. And these are states. States are behind the origins of such organizations. They design them, they fund them, importantly. And most funding, of course, comes from resource-richer countries. And this is reflected in the dominant direction of migration, global migration governance. More funding being dominant, you know, is devoted to management of migration, border control and so forth, rather than to the governance of the workplace. And this again is reflected in funding put aside for labor inspectorates, labor dispute settlement processes being far less than what is being spent on border control. So what this leaves us with is a situation where we actually have a sound normative framework, so rights on paper, but we still have a problem with the remaining and huge gap in terms of translating them into rights in practice. So, you know, in order to make a real change on the ground, so to speak. And all of this is highly relevant to the situation we find ourselves in right now, the COVID-19 pandemic. So the issues existing around, you know, the issues amplified by COVID, really, around this gap between rights on paper and rights in practice. So the irony really being that among the many so-called essential workers, right, there are all these precarious migrant workers, temporary contract workers, no residential rights, the many undocumented migrant workers working in essential key sectors of the economy, and yet have no access or very, very little access to social security put in place for them. Previous webinars have already covered some of this, you know, on the care sector and so forth. Next week's webinar, as far as I understand, we'll talk about wage theft. So again, COVID-19 giving unfortunately many employers the chance to not pay wages at all. And again, this exposes the fundamental flaws we also have in many bilateral agreements, the non-binding memoranda of understanding, the many bilateral agreements which cover no such thing as a clear, assigning clear responsibility for who deals with these kind of emergency situations. Now, I do know I'm running out of time, and my fellow panelists, luckily, will speak more about the regional perspective on governance. So my clear messages, I think, were, you know, quite clear. They might pick up on some nuances in relation to the regional level, which, you know, I'm looking forward to hearing. I guess I stop here and hand over to the next speaker. And I think, at the end, we will have a chance to come back to discuss some more detail and some more specific issues.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Great. Nicola, I really appreciate the kind of perspectives you brought in. I think what is also interesting for me is you started by saying, maybe I'll keep this to labor migration. And interestingly enough, I mean, for the ILO, we would say that most people are migrating with the element of perhaps thinking that at some point this migration will turn into work migration or migration for work and migration for employment. I mean, if we look at the global scenario of 72 million migrants, 164 million are migrant workers, but we still have that big chunk there who don't fall in the category of migrant workers. And for this, I think it's also important to then now take it from here. Nicola, thanks for setting the foundation. You spoke about the UN. I mean, I'm still thinking about the time I used to coordinate the Global Migration Group in 2009, 10. Yeah. I mean, things have moved from there. We now have a UN network for migration. But we're always asked, the governments and non-governmental stakeholders always ask UN, is the UN network for migration going to be different from the Global Migration Group? Are we going to deliver the promises that the UN really should step up to the role that we should be playing? Now, within that conversation, I would like to introduce the next speaker. To introduce the next speaker is actually doing a disservice to the next speaker. This is the former Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh, Ambassador Shahidul Haq, who played such a pivotal role over the last many years of his career with the government of Bangladesh, and even previous to that, in bringing a very strong, may I say, and with your permission, sir, say that bringing a strong Southern voice to the conversations on migration. I remember in New York once, just prior to the negotiations, the start of the negotiations, and in a way, Nicola, contradicting to what you mentioned about labor migration and the role that it played in global migration governance. Ambassador Shahidul Haq asked me, he said, so tell me this, is labor migration the only important thing in the global compact for migration? And I said, no, sir, it isn't. There are certainly other elements there that we need to look at. So the reason now for bringing Ambassador Haq to the table and to this conversation is to also focus on how exactly, particularly from the Southern Hemisphere, but globally as well, what is it that we need to do to perhaps rethink migration governance? Is that something that we need to look at now? I mean, the GCM is still very new, it's still very fresh, but is it time for us to perhaps go back to the table with the GCM and say, how best can we use it? Ambassador Haq, sir, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was quite embarrassing to see so many issues attached to my name. I hope I can do justice to that. What I'll try and do is, and thank you, Nicola, for setting what, how, and whom. Very nice way of summarizing things that should have been happened, must have been happened, didn't happen. What I'll do, I'll try and focus as to how pandemic is reshaping the migration. One. Second is where it is actually making an impact. 3 areas: remittance, labor flow, return, and human rights. So not that I'm excluding other issues, but I thought let's focus on that. And the third one is what possibly we need to do. And I'll try and look at quickly. The realities or realization is that things are changing. Too many times used new normal, but it looks like that even people like Kissinger saying that world order is going to be different. Now, the world order that was set after the Second World War, as you know, one of the new liberal pillars was refugee and migration regime. You see, it has collapsed, actually. Now we see that there is no system as such. So let's keep that in mind. So the interstate relation will change, the international cooperation will change, and so is the migration will change, and we'll have to. So that's to just saying that what needs to be done. I did an exercise as to looking at what are the set of factors that will unfold, which I call a new migration order. Which way it will go, I'll tell, depends on the member states. One is there's a whole set of a new economic landscape, workplace, the gig workers, the whole service sector. So possibly we don't have to move anymore to create wealth and work. Second, the development paradigm, absolutely redrawn. The geopolitical tension sitting in Delhi, you'll better understand that, some of you, if the power shifts in the way migration was conceived in the West, in the East, it may be conceived, looked at in a different angle. So that's the other one. And the third was the whole set of environmental factors. So these four sets of forces will continue to act. Now, it was actually a sort of a functioning. What pandemic has done, it has exposed some of the vulnerabilities and accelerated some of the changes in the migration and mobility world. Now, there's a very interesting kind of a way of looking at the consequences, and I'll just focus on four areas. First, the state adopted, rightfully so, they're sovereign, migration tool to combat pandemic, and I have written about it. Now, to start with, that was, I think, a knee-jerk reaction, and it really hurt the migration regime. So that's one. Second, it has further politicized and migration and mobility. In fact, some of the ultra-rightists are using it as a weapon to stop migration and mobility. So that's the second. Third is that, in the midst of it, people realized that these migrant workers are also front level workers. They have been actually supporting the struggle against the virus. So they brought a new category, which is called fundamental/essential workers. Now that's being debated globally, what it means, essential and fundamental workers, who should be allowed to cross borders. So what has actually happened is the pandemic, instead of not helping to combat the disease, it has actually resulted in a migration crisis. So first time we have a migration crisis without migrants being a major player. Now, as I said, I'll look at the three areas just to remind before I go into governance area. One is the slowdown of remittance and slowdown of human mobility. The World Bank has done a very good study. It's not only the flow of remittance, but also FDI, 35% drop. It is also private portfolio, 80% drop. So what it means for the world of migration? It means that there will be less and less work for people in sense. So it has really going to hurt. Now, on the most difficult challenge that this pandemic has created for the countries is the whole issue of return. I saw today in the GFMD discussion that the migrant workers have lost 400 million migrant workers have lost job. So what they're going to do? They'll have to come back to their home. So that has created a huge a lot of issues between the destination and origin countries. But what has happened? Now you cannot come back. So you are actually trapped. The whole trapped population, which we were using for the climate change analysis, now we are using it for the migrants. So you cannot come back, neither you can go back to your work. So what you do? You are actually on the street in a foreign land. So that's something we need to also look at. And in the midst, the human trafficking, the smugglers are making money. And I'll not go into that. Now, human rights has become a victim, as Nicola has rightly pointed out. It has always been a victim of discussion, as if when it comes to the world of migration or migrants, human rights doesn't exist. So that dichotomy has really made us a difficult choice. Now, this pandemic has also again exposed one issue, which we have been during our GFMD chairmanship focusing on, that it's very difficult to separate people's flow and the so-called mixed migration which is always has been a reality. So how do you differentiate between refugee movement, cross-border displacement, irregular migration, and irregular migration, especially in crisis time? And I think this is an area which, although New York Declaration did acknowledge, but eventually we had now again 2 legs to work on one body, which is called Compact on Refugees and Compact on Migration. I'm coming to an end. I know there'll be others who will be speaking. Now, I'll close with 4 rethinking, fundamental rethinking. One is that migration is again at crossroads, but migration shall never stop. Those who think that in the new world there will be no mobility, they are either making themselves a fool or they are not aware of the realities. And I'll not go into the drivers. I have a paper on that actually. Then second, that's the rethinking. Immigration and travel system will radically change. There is a study which has said that there will be 37 different kind of a new procedure introduced in the air travel business from door-to-door traveling. So 37 different kinds of, it will be costly, it will be expensive, it will be absolutely put the migrants who even sometimes do not know how to board in a plane in a very difficult situation. Now, there has been a discussion on the compact. Whatever you say, I think compact continue to remain the only comprehensive framework for governing international migration. Only one. I know 152 countries, but that is solid. And today is the 1 year of establishment of a global network of migration. So there are countries which have done a very good thing, including Bangladesh. Now, how do you actually take the compact and see how much it is relevant? There are many ways to do it. I thought let's do a cluster. So the first cluster is goal 5, which is a pathway for regular migration, goal 15, basic services, and goal 20, remittance. So if you took this as a cluster and try and see whether you can make something out of it in terms of a strategy, that could be a doable thing. Second is that goal 7 and goal 17 together, reduce vulnerabilities and perception of migrants. And this is a very critical to answer the ultra-rightist. Then the third is the G9 and 10, human trafficking and smuggling. So, and the last one is the return and sustainable reintegration and international cooperation. So if you take these 4 clusters and have a dialogue, that will be brilliant. I'm coming to almost an end. Now, there are other forums which has evolved over the years. One I can right now think of is that I'm sure our colleague will talk about it, the Switzerland UK initiative on remittance. They're very specific but very useful. The other one is the World Economic Forum, the whole great reset that the World Economic Forum is talking about. And I know within that there are also discussion of bringing in migration mobility, talent mobility, remittance issues. I just wrote a paper for them on South Asian remittance management. So let's hook up with this. Let's get out of only the traditional actors. Let's bring ourselves into the new set of organization, which possibly have a much better intervention strength than us. So let's see whether in the World Economic Forum Great Reset could look at migration. Three concluding thoughts, 3 sentences. First, corona pandemic spreads across border, but it is not a migration problem, but we have made into a migration problem. It's a very unfortunate story. Second, I think time has come when we should have a global dialogue. I know GFMD is there, so we can use that platform, but let's have a global dialogue on governance in a changing realities and circumstances. And I hate to say, but I think we possibly, basing on the Global Compact, we have to have a new migration order. At least we should be able to talk about it. Without that, future of migration will remain ad hoc, and the victims should be migrants. Thank you very much, and sorry to take so much of a time.
No, thank you, sir. I mean, Shahid sir, there's only one way we can explain this in terms of the perspectives that you have put forward, and that is maybe you should help us take off with that global migration discourse, a global migration governance discourse going forward. So thank you very much, sir. Some of the points that you were touching on, what I did was I put the Global Compact's guiding principles on the side, the 10 guiding principles, and your points. And sir, you touched on every one of them, whether it is the fact that it is about keeping it people-centered, international cooperation, national sovereignty. And this is why we also see some of these very closed-minded conversations coming from certain groups, political groups particularly. We see this in the form of rule of law that you were talking about, sustainable development angle that you bring in forward, the human rights perspective that both you and Nicola now touched on, gender-sensitive approach, and not forgetting that women form half of these migrants are women, the child responsive angle, so keeping in mind the family of migrant workers themselves, and of course the whole of government and whole of society approach, and everybody else that come together to make sure that migration governance works. So thank you, sir. Thanks for bringing all those elements in. I do worry when you talk about how immigration and travel systems will change, because I'm usually subjected to a lot of random checks at airports. So I'm not sure how exactly this will now, change things for me. But anyways, that brings us to the next speaker, sir, who in a way, I brought the next speaker together with you to also help us think about global migration governance. Now, this speaker, Ambassador Pietro Mona, he's somebody who has really, led the conversations at the global level in a number of contexts. And I think anything that I say will once again be doing him a disservice. But what I can say is this: Ambassador Pietro Mona is perhaps one of those people who has actually supported the conversations to be driven also from a Southern perspective. He has always tried to live true to what the government of Switzerland's perspective are in building bridges between the North and the South, the East and the West. Pietro, if I may say, is a good friend, a former colleague. I've had the privilege of working with him. And he also led the Swiss delegation as the head of the Swiss delegation for the intergovernmental negotiations of the Global Compact for Migration. Pietro Mona, your microphone starts now.
Thank you very much, Shabri, and it's fantastic to be in this webinar with all of you. And again, the question, if you hear me and see me, because currently I can't see anyone and can't hear anyone. Okay, perfect. All right, good. Thank you very much. So this discussion, as it is framed, is about global and regional migration governance in times of COVID. But as my previous speakers did, and here I really salute Ambassador Shahidul Haq, who I find an absolute brilliant thinker on migration issues and on many other issues that I've had the privilege in exchanging thoughts with him. I think the ambassador already outlined quite well how COVID has impacted migration, how it will impact, how it will change the way that migration will be managed, governed, or not governed in the future, also because of COVID. Nonetheless, I think I dare to say that in many respects, I fully agree with his position. In many respects, however, when we look at the practical challenges, the vulnerabilities that migrant workers and migrants in general across the world are suffering now, I think many of the points we've actually, at one point or the other, have already touched upon in the myriads of discussions that we've had in the past, be it in the Global Forum on Migration Development, being in the UN, being during the negotiations of the Global Compact at the ILO, when we talk, for example, about fair and ethical recruitment procedures, or at the regional or at the national level. I think very much my position is in that sense that COVID has exacerbated, it has put a bright light on the vulnerabilities, but also on the weaknesses of our current system at all levels, at the local, national, regional, and global level. I think it has torn away, so to say, or it has opened our eyes on how a pandemic that is now turning into a macroeconomic crisis at the global level has impacted also the field of migration. And I think this is the first point that I would like to keep in mind, is that to many of the challenges that we're seeing now, to the questions of labor rights for migrant workers, to the questions of protective measures for domestic workers, on remittances, on return and reintegration, on mobility in general, I think in one way or the other, we have solutions, or we have ideas on how we can approach them. The question now is more, where is the political will? Where are the instruments? Where are the actors that can actually implement what we have thought of? Let's take the question of remittances. The ambassador has mentioned an initiative that we've launched together with the UK a couple of weeks back. It's a call to action highlighting concrete measures that governments, central banks, regulators, but also the private sector can take on remittances to ensure that the flow of remittances keeps going and that we try to reduce at least the negative impact COVID has had. The World Bank is talking about around $110 billion of remittances that are not going to developing countries because of COVID. $110 billion, that is about 2/3, 3/4 of the official development aid worldwide, just to give you a point of reference there. Now, when we come to the measures that we proposed, for example, using digital measures, for example, ensuring financial literacy, ensuring financial inclusion of migrants and their families, making sure that the transfer costs are being reduced. These are not new things. We have talked about them many, many times in various forums, including the G20, who has also had a plan of actions on reducing the transfer costs. So I think this underlines the fact that many of the solutions, many of the instruments are there, but it's a question of using them and implementing them. The second general point, and I will come then to the question of the governments, is very much also to understand, and I think this has also shown clearly in the last few months, how the issues of migration are interconnected with so many other topics. How migration, for example, the challenges that domestic workers are faced are so much interlinked with gender aspects in general. We've seen how labor migration issues are embedded in a much broader debate about the future of work, about labor rights, about the context in which labor should happen so that we have decent and appropriate workplaces for all persons. We've seen, and this is another initiative that Switzerland has taken, the impact COVID has had on education, also impacting many migrant children, in particular also undocumented migrant children, but also refugee children, displaced children, who were not able to go to school anymore. And education, schools for them is often a place where they can feel safe, where they can get an education, but also where they have interactions with their peers. I think this is where we see how what we do on migration has to be understood also in a broader context. And we have to continue finding inclusive solutions. We have to understand that any rhetoric that proposes us and them creates barriers. We have to understand that migrants are part of our societies. I've been migrant on several occasions when I worked in Nigeria, for example, when I worked in Armenia. I don't want to feel as segregated from a society. I want to be part of the society. And I think COVID has created a sense of coming together, of inclusiveness. And this is something that also looking forward on the governance issues, I think we have to nurture, we have to embrace that when it comes to migration, ideally we think in inclusiveness. We think about what measures can we take to strengthen a health system at the national level for everyone, including migrants. What can we do to work towards gender equality so that through that we can have a dialogue on the importance of protecting domestic migrant workers who by and large are women. We have to look at education. We have to look at our financial system. We have to look at all measures in a way that it profits both the host communities and the migrant communities, so that we can move forward in a very inclusive and comprehensive way, as it is actually ingrained in the DNA of the 2030 Agenda. The 2030 Agenda is a masterpiece of multilateral negotiations, in my view, because it very much carries this image of us in a world with limited resources, one planet, one humanity. We have to find solutions together. And this entails very much also understanding migration as part of this. And how migration actually brings us together. In preparing this webinar, I just reminded of a concept that the ambassador Shahidul Haq used a lot during the chairmanship of Bangladesh of the GFMD. It's about connectivity. We talked, inspired by his critical thinking, we talked a lot about the importance of migration as an instrument to create connections, as connectivity. And I think this is very much in line with my thinking about connectivity and inclusiveness. I think this goes hand in hand. Now, what does this mean for the governance structure? I think for the governance structure, I'm quite skeptical if you really have to rethink everything. But I do appreciate the clarity of Nicola's presentation, also the critical points that she highlighted. But to an extent, it is also how can we best use the structures that we already have? And maybe then we can also come to the conclusion that some of them have to be adapted or expanded or new ones created. But what I think is important, and that ties back to, I hope, to the points that I made before, is that we look at the governance in the future. I think there are two elements that I will propose we should strive towards to be better apt in responding to the challenges of migration under COVID, but also the opportunities that migration in general has for sustainable development and the governments and the societies involved. This is firstly about a horizontal adaptation, so to say, expanding horizontally our governance structures. What do I mean by that? I think by
Pietro, sorry, in about a minute and a half, if you could conclude. Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah.
Horizontally for me is making sure that all the partners are included at the table. I think in the GFMD, for example, we have come to a conclusion that it's quite useless to talk about labor migration without the private sector at the table. We are still working, I have to admit, on having a sensible and appropriate way to include the trade unions. But believe me, I'm very much in favor of making sure that the trade unions also have an appropriate representation in the GFMD. We have now started to learn how important it is to have local authorities at the table. We have, for quite some time, but it has been an uphill battle, included civil society much more in our discussions as governments or between governments in the GFMD. So this is the horizontal expansion that we have to make sure that happens in the governance structure, bringing all the parties to the table. The vertical expansion that I see that should happen when it comes to governance of migration is to make sure that we understand on what we're doing on, for example, again, using the same example, domestic workers, how that ties to a broader gender policy or gender initiative. How what we are doing in ensuring access for migrants or refugees or displaced persons to health, how that ties towards a broader health debate. So we have to make these connections also vertically between migration issues and the overarching theme that we are addressing, because I believe that I think COVID has shown how all of these things are interconnected. Finally, and this is really my last point, and very briefly, I think we really have to embrace multilateralism. I think this is where the solutions have to be debated, have to be found. Those that are already on the table have to be taken and run with it together with our partners. But we do see a tendency in crisis that governments retreat back to national policies. They go back behind their borders. I think we have to do everything possible to push that back. Multilateralism is a key instrument to overcome. And I think this is where we then have to discuss, and this is what will come now, how we can actually interlink what we're discussing at the global level, guided by the 2030 agenda, together with the regional level and then maybe also the national level. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Pietro. I think, you know, in so many ways, I'm going to one, thank you for the shout out that you have given to both the trade unions and the employers. I think it's important that we recognize the importance of the role that they play. And I'm glad that you will persevere to continue engaging with the Global Forum in a manner which also sees a good and inclusive incorporation of trade unions. I think it's very important to recognize that. I like what you said, 2030 agenda is a masterpiece of multilateral agenda. So please permit me to quote you on that line at some point in time when I intervene on the 2030 agenda. In fact, I always think that the 2030 agenda or the SDGs is on steroids. It's basically the MDG on steroids is what we've got for the SDGs. You know, so it's important to recognize the fact that in 2000 the Millennium Development Goals had absolutely no reference to migration, and come 2015 we have migration peppered across the 2030 agenda. And I know that as well, Switzerland and Bangladesh as two governments led those conversations from the forefront. So embracing multilateralism is really key to this. Our Director General, the ILO Director General, Guy Ryder, also talks about the importance of multilateralism in such precarious times that we are in. Thank you very much, Pietro. We have four more speakers, and now we get into the regional conversations and the regional thinking on this. But I also saw in the participants list a whole group of people who have been engaged in so many different levels from global to regional. And I think it is important to mention the names of a few of them. I noticed that the Bangladesh ambassador to Jordan, Her Excellency Nahida Soban, is also here amongst us. So, ma'am, welcome. Very glad that you were here. I know that you worked very closely with Ambassador Huq during the GCM negotiations, the SDG conversations, and so on. So happy to have you here. I also noticed that Fatima Alfain from the Comoros mission in New York, who was the coordinator of the Africa group during the negotiations of the GCM, is also present. So Fatima, welcome. I'm glad that you've been able to make it. And then, of course, there's a whole range of other people. I noticed that the General Secretary of the South Asian Regional Trade Union Confederation Council, Mr. Lakshman Basnat is here, Ms. Eileen Sana from the Philippines, Mr. Didar Singh, the former secretary when it was still Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs. Mr. Didar Singh is here, Pushpendra Kumar, let's say an academic and a thinker, you know, someone who I would always go to and lean on his shoulders for thoughts and perspectives on various issues. We also have quite a few diaspora members. I see Thomas Kadavil and Madhavan Kalat from Kuwait and Bahrain, respectively, doing some tremendous work there. Binod Kadria is here, and Professor Kadria, of course, is an institution by himself. Charles Anelo from Nigeria is also here. Evelyn Tennant and Piasiri Vikramasekara from the Global Migration Policy Associates, Felix Bronsdorf from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Germany, Gayatri Kant from the International Organization for Employers, Gemma Edaba, who worked very closely from the side of the International Trade Union Confederation on the GCM, of course, Professor Margaret Robert Walton, and Mr. Kuntia, who is a trade union leader with the the Indian National Trade Union Confederation here in India. So really warm welcome to all of you. I'm glad that all of you have been able to make it. Now with this, I move to the regional setting. And to the regional setting, I first call upon the speaker who I have listened to for a long time, someone I have learned a lot from, someone who's really carried with him the migration perspectives in Asia, Mr. William Goyes. In fact, I remember William once telling me every time I spoke about partnerships, and partnerships is a part of that multilateral conversation, he said, It's easy to shake the tree to say that we need partnerships, but the roots are too deep rooted. So William, help us plant more trees for partnerships at the regional level and take us through this journey that Asian migration governance is about. Thank you.
Hi, Shabri, and thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to just also focus and build on what some of the other speakers before me have said. And just to say, that the transmission is not as smooth as we would like it to be, or it is not as natural as we might think it is. I think, in fact, there is a very big, and in our experience as civil society, we have seen that there is a very big fault line between the global and the regional. And that fault line lies largely also in some ways in just a transmission of memory. What happens at the global stays at the global. What happens at the regional stays at the regional. And there is not a two-way process between this. And I think that is why it is interesting that this year's GFMD has brought a different twist to the whole GFMD after 14 years, to bring in the regional processes to be involved in some way with the global forum, just to be able to, as it was said in the working papers, get the regional nuances in a global discourse. So I think that alone says something, that after a 14-year kind of process, this happens like that. Whether it is the UN processes or whether it is intergovernmental processes. This disconnect is also, I think, between capitals and between what happens in Geneva or New York. For capitals, what happens on the ground is very different from what happens in New York and in Geneva. And I think that disconnect as well is something that we would have to look at in terms of it's not only a bureaucratic process, but it's also a politically imbibed process in terms of that kind of disconnect. And we have seen this also in the negotiations around the Global Compact on Migration. In the initial stages where the discussions were going to be held, whether Geneva, New York, and things like that, there is always this kind of a difference between which house makes it more political and which house advances that discourse. So that highlights something in some ways what Nicola has said. And that is why I think from our perspective, that a lot of this migration discourse gets at a certain stage unreal in the sense of, from a migrant's perspective, there is the big deficits of the human rights agenda. And this is something that even Sir Shahid ul-Haq has just said. When it comes then to the local issue, at the ground, at the regional level, the politicization of the issue is something that gets picked up very fast, very easily. Migration for political leaders is not a popular topic. It's not a vote winner. And that's why any politician taking on the issues of migration from a rights-based perspective is actually not going to be very popular with the major populace. And that is something also that we might want to look at. It is how then can you move an agenda of migration at the regional and local level. I like Pietro's vision when he says we have to move towards integration, inclusion, and like in ASEAN, we say welcoming societies, But how do we get there? And if you look at the current discourse on migration that is happening in this time of COVID, it's so polarized, not across borders only. In your own country, in India itself, you have seen the internal migration discourse polarizing society, Indian society. So it becomes such a polarizing discourse in so many ways that this formula of we first, whatever it is, whether it is at the country level, whether it is at the state level, whether it is at the ethnicity in terms of majority ethnicity group in any given province or state, there is always the we first attitude to the exclusion of the other. And how do we break this? I don't think there is a formula for this. Even if the SDGs talks in goal 16 about inclusive societies, And even if there's beautiful slogans of leaving no one behind and things like that, in the COVID, like Uridia Rajan has often said, the COVID has left migrants way behind. They are those who have been marginalized under normal times, but now under COVID, they have been totally externalized kind of thing. And I think this is something we will have to look at. Look at the language around migrants today in many of the predominant migrant receiving countries. You look at the media that you find, media coverage in the Gulf countries, and forget the Gulf countries, look at countries of origin itself. The countries of origin prior to COVID had this process of calling migrants heroes, whatever language it was, and they were called heroes, present day heroes kind of thing. But when you look at it today, the fear of the pandemic has left returning migrants not being able to go back home because their own communities have prevented them from arriving back home. So they are stuck in international airports, or they are stuck at the national airports, and they have not been allowed to go back to their homes, to their communities, largely because of the fear that they might be carriers of the pandemic. So I think it is important, therefore, when we talk about global governance, that we need to, coming out of this COVID, we will have to look at what we do. And I've always said this, with my frustration sometimes with these UN processes or the intergovernmental processes, is that if this was the corporate sector, and why we want so much private sector to be part of our conversations, if intergovernmental processes and UN processes were designed along corporate strategy, none of this would have been funded the next day. They would have all collapsed, largely because the deliverables is not commensurate with the investment that has been put in this. And when I'm saying investment, I'm talking about time of people, knowledge that is invested, money that has been invested in a lot of these things. And that's why I think I would emphasize what Pietro said much more strongly, is that we have to generate a new kind of political will. A new kind of political will has to be generated, even if it means recognizing at this time how political leaders have failed us, and therefore recognizing who are our leaders of the future that will bring us out of situations of crisis. Because this crisis and this kind of pandemic is possibly the new normal of a future that our children will have to walk into. And so I think taking political activity and looking at political leadership will be a much more serious exercise in terms of also migration governance. Then I also like to say, and with regard to in terms of governance, and Pietro has mentioned this as well, I think at the end of the day, a formula needs to change. In the sense of the first question when we come to such meetings is, what difference is this meeting going to make in the lives of migrants? We have to ask that question. You know, like you have these mission vision plannings, you have all sorts of ways in coming to know what is the objective you want out of this. When we go to donors say, okay, so what is your objective? What is your goal? And now SDG has goals and targets kind of thing. So the first thing of any intergovernmental meeting should be, what difference is this going to make in the life of migrants? Second question, like Pietro says, who is at the table? You know, and whoever is at the table, in what capacity are they at the table? Are they in the capacity to observe and listen? Are they in the capacity to contribute, participate, and design? And then, are we, when we are together at the table, going to go for the lowest hanging fruit to start with? Or are we going to be much more ambitious than that? The COVID has shown us how fragile our societies are and how fragile our communities are. It's time we have a new sense of solidarity, which people have called in terms of a new social contract and things like that. And I think it's time we started looking at things from a whole different perspective. Migrants are not the other. Migrants are not the alien. Like example, for the Philippines, where I am, I still have what is called an alien certificate of registration. Migrants are not the other. They are not the alien. Migrants are those human beings that live within the jurisdictions of our state. And therefore, it is the right of the state to protect every human being with rights and dignity within its jurisdiction, irrespective with the principle of non-discrimination. I think this is something we will have to look at, and we will have to make an honest assessment of what has happened to migrants in this time. And it's not only about rights. I think our societies have lost something in this COVID, in our treatment with migrants. And that is, we have lost a sense of what human dignity is all about. And I think that is even deeper than the legal framework of rights. It's just about understanding what is our common humanity. And I think this is where we need to come out of the COVID and see how we are going to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. What is our common humanity and the focus on human dignity? It's so true, isn't it? I mean, when we think about that migrant worker who is either coming back from the Middle East, back to South Asian countries or to African countries, or even now within India, when we talk about migrant workers moving across the country, I don't think dignity is really the one area that people are talking about or focusing on. Dignity of labor is also not necessarily the conversation here. How do we bring it back to that? I like what you say, William, with regards to migration not being a vote winner. But I wonder how Portugal did it. You know, the government of Portugal has just given, because of COVID, all migrant workers equal rights to citizens. Can we do that? Can we do that in South Asia? Is that really possible? Let's say that's the ideal situation. I wonder how that will actually work out. You know, I like when you say that migrants are not aliens, and I particularly then want to ask the participants the question, everybody who's present here, and I see that there is a huge count of participants here. I wonder then, what difference is this webinar going to do to change the lives of migrants in general? Anyways, with that, I come to the next speaker, straight out of the Arabian shores, Ms. Rula Hamathi, who is the coordinator for the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, based out of Lebanon, but Rula is currently living in Doha. And I know this is a conversation that Rula and I've had on many occasions in many different spaces. I think the big perspective here, Rula, would be to understand how you feel these conversations that you hear translates to a Middle Eastern vibe, translates to a conversation from the Arab states. Thanks, Rula, over to you.
Thanks, Shabri. Yeah, I think, you know, when we were kind of thinking about this webinar and preparing for this webinar, the question was, how do these kind of global frameworks translate at the regional and national level, and they translate into realities? So I guess to kind of answer the question, I just want to start by saying, and I think William kind of said it, it's not smooth. So there are a lot of obstacles when we talk about translating global frameworks into realities on the ground. And to start within the particular context of the Arab region, I think it's, you know, it's important to realize that in the region, at least in the Arab region, that the relationship between these kinds of, you know, frameworks and you know, governments taking it on has been a bit complicated. So for instance, if you want to look at the two biggest questions in terms of, you know, mobility and movement in the region, which is basically migration and refugee flows. And then we look at the legal frameworks for these kinds of movements, we realize that, you know, most of these frameworks are not either, you know, adopted or ratified by the governments in question. So let's say the Convention on Migrant Workers is, you know, the part of the Arab countries that have adopted this convention, for instance, are countries that don't necessarily receive migrant workers. So mostly the North African countries that have migration flows towards Europe. By contrast, if we look at the Refugee Convention, we also realize that a lot of the countries that have not, you know, that receive refugees have not ratified the Refugee Convention. So there is a little bit of this kind of dynamic and relationship in the region. The Global Compact on Migration, which is a kind of a different framework, has been, you know, an interesting exercise, I would say, for the region in the sense of at the beginning, and at least in the negotiation phase, there was a kind of, an involvement by countries in the region in the negotiation of the framework. But now when we go to the implementation of the Global Compact, we see that this initial enthusiasm or initial kind of involvement is also kind of withering down. And I guess we'll get to that in a little bit. The other issue or the other obstacle that I guess is also there is really in relation to a contradiction, a direct contradiction between how migration is and how migration is governed in practice versus how these frameworks, say migration should be governed. And I give two examples here. The first example, for instance, if you look at, how migration is in the Gulf region, for example, we can see that a lot of it is, the circular labor migration, process or temporary labor migrants. If we look, for instance, at the Global Compact, Objective 16, about the full inclusion, obviously there is kind of a contradiction there. And I think these are kind of tensions that exist throughout in terms of how migration is really, and how kind of these frameworks, try to govern migration. So there is this conflict. Another conflict, and obviously you remember, Shabri, is, if you remember in the negotiations of the Global Compact, for example, the Arab group was very strongly vocal against any kind of, talk about the right to asylum, talk about international protection, talk about mixed movement, talk about non-refoulement, and all these kinds of bigger questions. There was strong pushback precisely because, there are kind of these tensions in the region. My third point, and that's obviously an obstacle that many people have talked about, is really that, adopting frameworks at the global level, ratifying conventions, adopting the compact and all of that does not necessarily translate into action at the national level. And this is, this is because of a lot of things. Obviously, some of them also include kind of the legal framework in the country. Others include the whole notion of the rule of law, institutional capacities and all of that. So I guess this is something also to look at when we talk about how do these frameworks translate into kind of actions on the ground. And the fourth, I guess, and in connection to the third, point is really that, there is a kind of a problem that is becoming apparent within the nature of these frameworks, whether, whether they are compacts, whether they are kind of treaties and all of that. I mean, an obvious kind of critique to the compact that everybody was kind of talking about a lot in the beginning was that it was not a non-binding instrument, obviously. And this is true for non-binding instruments, but also it is even true for binding instruments, because on the ground and in reality, although there are different recourses that can, someone can take in case of violations, but the consequences are not there because it's such a lengthy, complicated bureaucratic process that often it is, it's like there are no kinds of consequences for, non-implementation. And finally, I think that brings us to the whole question of, the question of incentives. So if countries are only going to implement, if they kind of consent to implement, then what is kind of the bigger value of having frameworks like this? And I think this is something we will need to reflect on. And I realize that, more or less I've given kind of gloomy or dim picture, but I'm not saying that there is no kind of value to having frameworks or coming together around these kinds of processes. And I think one value, and in particular to this region, is obviously of setting the norm, setting the standard. So what is the standard against which we measure ourselves, we compare ourselves, and what should we be looking at and aspiring to do? And I think this is important and interesting, and you can see that a lot of countries also try to, belong to this global community that kind of looks at the governance of migration in a certain way. And that has been an incentive in certain cases, obviously, and not in all cases, for countries to do reforms. But I think, we've heard a lot about projects and, initiatives and small initiatives. And also maybe William spoke about low-hanging fruits. And I think this is kind of where we are in kind of the bigger picture of things. This is where the focus is, and how can we kind of shift from this small, focus on small initiatives, small projects, to the wider bigger transformative agenda? I think this is the question. If we look at the Arab region again, I think we will see that this has been one of the regions that have moved a lot in terms of policy making and policy processes. And this is something, this is something good. This is something to look at and to think about how can we do more of it. And in particular within this region, I think the region that has moved more than the rest is actually the GCC, where a lot of policy developments have been happening over the past few years. And obviously this is not a kind of a full picture policy movement. Obviously this policy have been focused on some of the aspects relevant, for instance, labor governance, trafficking. A lot of policies have touched on that, or even irregular migration. But the question then becomes of how do we have a more kind of comprehensive process? And I think just to kind of conclude, I think that there is a trend now, as Nicola talked to kind of move towards this, soft law approach and less binding approach of doing things. And this has obviously, as Nicola has said, come at the expense of rights. And I think we recognize this as a weakness generally of the process. And I think we need to find ways to kind of go beyond this, low-hanging fruit approach. The other thing, kind of my final point on this, I think is, we've heard a lot about how COVID has impacted migration. And I think it's also interesting to note that one of the ways is, has been really kind of the resurgence of member states as really the primary actors. I don't think we've heard anybody kind of come and say, well, according to GCM objective so and so, we need to do this and that. And I think this is something to reflect on, because when emergency strikes, I think we are seeing kind of a return back to the nation model of doing things. So.
Great, thanks so much. Rula, I wouldn't really call the picture gloomy, because you underlined it with a very important perspective, and that is the fact that we have perhaps seen such a big rise in policy developments in the Middle East, in the Arab states, which is so important for us to recognize. And for me, therefore, the picture is not yet gloomy. I obviously try to always look at the light at the end of the tunnel, or the cloud with the silver lining, and not forget that there is always something that we can lead to on a much more positive perspective. You mentioned Rula, about the less binding approach of some of these perspectives. I mean, I remember very well, whether we're talking about regional processes or global agendas, it's always, what is it? Non-binding, informal, state-led, voluntary, action-oriented. These are the kind of perspectives we put forward. And I remember Bangladesh was perhaps the only government under the leadership of the foreign secretary and the others during the negotiations of the GCM that really spoke about maybe perhaps focusing the GCM to be a binding document. Now, let's just put it this way. Even without it being binding, only 152 out of the 193 member states, majority, of course, adopted it. Now, if it was binding, how different would things have been? So perhaps something for us to also reflect along those lines. Thanks so much, Rula. When we talk about policy developments, then it is also imperative for us to understand that there is another region. Policy developments in the Middle East not only affect Asia, it also affects Africa. And this is where I bring in my next speaker, Mr. Charles Obila from the IGAD Secretariat. And Charles, really, I think, so good to have that African voice in this conversation. For us, it is very important in Asia, simply because there is this strong bond that we have in terms of learning what Africa has in this context. So Charles, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shabari. It's been very informative for me to listen to the other previous speaker. I must say I'm not going to speak anything new. Perhaps I'll repeat from majority of what has already been spoken to, but I'll try to give the regional perspectives, if I may say. IGAD, of course, is one of the regional economic communities in the Horn of Africa. We are a membership of 8 member states, and therefore we are just a small proportion of the African countries. So it's 8 out of the 55 African states, a very small representation. So I would want to make a disclaimer that I'm not speaking for the African bloc per se, but I would guess that some of these some of the experiences that I'm going to share will actually apply to the other countries in the African continent. When it comes to migration, of course, migration for us is just a means of survival. We cannot live without the options to migrate. But the reality is, again, despite the need and the functionality of migration to our daily subsistence, we are also in a context where we do not have, let's say, expanded opportunities for regular mobility. And for us, again, migration is a very dynamic in nature. Here, we really cannot differentiate, say, between refugees and migrants. We have the phenomenon of mixed migration, where you have different categories of people moving together using the similar means and perhaps looking for similar alternatives, mainly livelihoods and employment. Mobility in the region occurs largely within the region, but we also have migration to the Gulf countries. We also have migration to the European Union. And more closely, we have migration towards the southern part of Africa. Just so, again, it's mainly because of employment and income differentials, so people trying to look out for their livelihoods. In terms of the impact of COVID on migration, I would say one, with the onset of the COVID pandemic and the first cases in the region, of course, governments in the region largely responded in similar ways to the way other governments responded in terms of lockdown, in terms of travel ban. And in terms of these, those who are mostly affected were those in the urban areas. And you know, again, IGAD is so unique in the sense that the most resilient migrants are usually in the urban areas. And it's not just migrants, even the most resilient refugees are the ones who are in the urban areas. Those are the ones who are able to find employment, require limited support, and are able to support themselves and the families, and perhaps almost send remittances to their families back home. So when the lockdown came, of course, majority of those who are the most resilient ones are the ones who lost their jobs. They're the ones who lost their livelihoods. They're the ones who are mostly affected by COVID. But over and above that, in terms of the regional dynamics, again, there are some things that came into play. One, from the onset, there was the fear of the foreigner, mainly the narrative that the foreigners were the ones who are spreading the virus. And therefore, there was some tendency to point out at migrants and point out at those who are not considered natives as the perpetrators or those who are spreading the virus. And that in itself also played to the vulnerability of the migrants themselves, whereby most of them were targeted and they could not move over and above the restrictions. We also had a lot of deportations, largely within the region, countries in the region. So you'd have neighboring countries trying to deport migrants of a certain country. So you want to take them back to where they came from, largely because you thought they were the ones who were spreading the virus. We also had a lot of involuntary returns and deportation from other regions, mainly the Gulf countries and partly from the Southern Africa. And that has grown, though we've seen over time now, there's been some discussions on how to coordinate better to conduct the returns, largely because, again, you're returning people to areas where perhaps the testing capacities are still very low. The beds capacities in hospital or the services, health services are strained. So there was the need to agree on a more coordinated approach to returns or having people go back in a safe and regular manner. This, I can say, has been some of the initiative or the efforts to promote that international cooperation and dialogue in the current health emergency phase. But this is to say that not all the needs have been addressed. Of course, we've also had a huge pileup of stranded migrants, particularly in majority of urban areas in the Horn of African countries. This is because, of course, most of them are working in the private sector, but because of the lockdown and the travel bans, they're not able to find employment or they're not able to travel back to their home countries. So you have a lot of floating masses, if I may call, of those stranded migrants. The other thing that we've seen in the region is, again, initially we had these flows, internal flows of people moving from rural areas to look for employment in urban areas. But because of the COVID pandemic itself, you're almost seeing like a reversal of that flow. So we are seeing more people wanting to move back to the rural areas where perhaps the areas are not so congested. You might do the social distancing, the contacts are not as high, and the COVID cases are much lower. So that is how we are seeing it. But perhaps to bring it forward and in terms of how we've seen the responses going on, one is there was a political leadership or a political decision that was taken by the heads of states in the IGAD countries, where they came together to develop or to adopt a regional health response strategy. And one thing that was unique, they specifically mentioned the integration of vulnerable population, including migrants and refugees, in the health responses. So that was one innovative approach. And over and above that, we've also seen the support from external partners like the EU, Sweden, Swiss, coming in to support such initiatives to ensure that no one is left behind and we are integrating everyone in the countries or in the territories where they are currently hosted. And I would see, again, that is like some show of solidarity and international cooperation in addressing the COVID pandemic. But if I might reflect it further, perhaps for me, what I look at is the current phases. We are currently in the health emergency phase. We don't know for sure how long this will play out, but we are hoping that there will be perhaps the recovery and the post-recovery phase. It's just that we don't know the timing of this. But what I want to say is that I see the need for international cooperation, or the true test of multilateralism or international cooperation will be in the recovery and post-recovery. Why I'm saying so is, of course, the pressure to migrate will be there because people have lost their jobs, remittances have declined, so there'll be need to support more because 60% of remittances into the region was going into basic services like food, shelter, health, education, and so forth. But now that has now declined. And people have been brought back, the returnees and the deportees. They're coming back to an environment of scarcity. So in the recovery and in the post-recovery phase, there'll be some pressure, the migratory pressure that will be there. There'll be more people will be looking out for opportunities. They'll want to move around to look for opportunities, both for employment and for their livelihood. And therefore, the need for international cooperation or how governments will react to the governance of migration will be determined more during the recovery phase. I'm saying this with a lot of caution because, again, we've lived through the similar experiences. For example, we know the framing of the migration crisis in 2015 was not necessarily a crisis because of the numbers of those people who were moving, but it was in the crisis because of the approaches the governments took towards migration. So if you're going to adopt a similar approach currently, when we really have the need and the pressure for people to move in order to find opportunities and jobs in whatever territory, then I see that majority of those who would would have the highest need to move would not be able to move. And this would perhaps drive people either to move in irregular ways, drive people to look for services of smugglers, if I may say. We'll see high cases of trafficking, not just within the region, but also between the regions, say, for example, the Horn of Africa and the EU, or the Horn of Africa and the Gulf countries. But it also provides an opportunity in a way. If we can harness the political will, if somebody would rise beyond the national sovereignty, beyond the checks, and ensure that we really have expanded opportunities for migration, and ensure that in as much as we want to phrase the narrative, the crisis narrative, we determine the end in such a way that it is to move those who are most vulnerable out of their vulnerability and to allow them to find some form of self-reliance. Then I would see perhaps us giving life to the global compact for migration in itself, and really ensuring that perhaps we give true meaning to migration as a poverty eradication strategy. Of course, here again, it depends with how member states will react. I'm not sure, I would not say for certain that this will happen. But I must say that for the African continent in a great way, the momentum was already there. In 2018, the African heads of state adopted 2 critical protocols, one on the continental free movement regime and the one on continental free trade area. So this was opening up opportunities for Africans within the African territory. But now COVID has come in, borders are closed. we are going to have perhaps stringent measures to allow for mobility. If these curtails the already existing and limited opportunities for mobility, then again, that might not really bring to light the ideals that the African states had set on course. That will drag us back. And of course, again, when it comes to the issues of remittances, that has already gone down, and we know kids are not going to schools. Refugees who are dependent on remittances, right now, their rations have been cut mainly by the humanitarian agencies, and they are not receiving enough remittances. Again, there is pressure not just from migrants themselves, but also from the refugees. And in the region, at the moment, we host close to 12 million displaced population, comprising of 8 million IDPs and 4 million refugees. So you can imagine that pressure alone for these people to find livelihood. That would put additional pressure, not just on the host countries, but on the transit and destination countries. So this, in a way, for me, it calls for that international solidarity. But again, it's just a matter of how we will phrase the migration narrative going forward. If we phrase it as a crisis, then we will lose the opportunity. But if we phrase this as a poverty eradication strategy, then I think we can give light to the global compact on migration. As I conclude, I would want to touch on 3 issues again. One is, now we are also moving towards not the health emergency, but the recovery phase where you're talking about livelihood, food security, and most importantly, peace and security. Because the issues of transnational crime, radicalization into terrorism and what have you, all these are going to come into play. And perhaps for us, the African continent, 2020 is also a unique year in the sense that this is the year that the EU and AU, the African Union and the European Union, are supposed to hold the Continental Summit. The last one in 2015, of course, brought into light the discussions of migration. So it will be interesting to see how migration will be featured in the current pandemic phase or in the current crisis phase. Shabari, I would want to stop here and perhaps I'll contribute more in terms of the questions from the participants.
Thanks so much, Charles. You know, I have been such a horrible moderator. I have not been close to telling anybody with regards to sticking to time, simply because I have been so engaged in just listening to everybody myself. Such important points. You know, I'm just thinking when you were saying about the migration crisis in 2015, that the approach, that this was not because of a crisis necessarily, but because of the approach that governments took to migration in general. And that's, I think, very important to note. So that leads me to say then, migration crisis in 2015, where was, as per this approach that you were saying that governments were taking, where exactly were these migrants heading to? And that specifically was majority of them going to Europe, with the understanding that even now we have to always say that 80% of migrants in Africa move within Africa. Not all of them are catching boats to Europe. That is not the case. You know, unfortunately, I think that conversation is still very difficult, and perhaps we are not communicating it in the right manner as well. So with that, I think that brings me to our last speaker, Professor Andrew Geddes from the European University Institute. Andrew, tell us what we can do differently from a European perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Great, thanks. Many thanks to the organisers for inviting me to contribute. And many thanks to the participants for sticking it out for an hour and a half to get to me. I'll try and be to the point. What I want to do is talk about the governance of migration in Europe, because I think that regional governance in Europe has some interesting lessons for global governance. I'm going to just talk very quickly about 4 things. One about crisis, one about policy, one about politics, and a point about the future. So that's what I'm going to organise this brief intervention around these 4 points, which all link to the theme of governance. So I've only got a few minutes. I can't really go into, so many issues we could go into, but I'm just going to focus particularly on governance. And I'm particularly interested in that because I think the arrangements, governance arrangements, institutions, laws, policies, and the ideas that inform them have huge implications for migration and mobility. So governance is really important. It's not just a reaction to migration, it shapes that migration. I think we need to understand governance, as this webinar has done, as being very crucial. So first point, crisis, was just mentioned by Shabari just now in terms of the relations between the EU and Africa. What I would say is that the crisis of 2015, however understood, and I think in particular it was became a political crisis in Europe, was a driver of global developments. But if we look in Europe, there was a financial crisis after 2008, which was a global financial crisis. There was obviously what was called the migration crisis after 2015. But I would argue that neither led to significant institutional policy changes. I think the direction of travel of EU migration and asylum policy was established in the early 1990s. So I don't expect the COVID-19 crisis to lead to a fundamental change in EU and European migration and asylum policies. Previous crises haven't, and I'd be surprised if this one did, because I think the choices have been made and are quite deeply embedded. Second, in relation to policy. So if we look at policy in the European Union, I think there's a big contrast between what would be called internal and external dimensions of policy. Internal is essentially the free movement and mobility provisions that are a kind of founding principle of the European Union dating back to the 1950s and realised through the 1960s and subsequently with important legal developments which provide rights of free movement for EU citizens. More recent on the scene has been measures applied to non-EU citizens, and in particular I think what's developed since the 1990s is what will be called an external dimension of migration and asylum policy, and that's particularly relevant in relation to what Charles was just talking about from the IGAD perspective and also from African Union perspective, the implications of the external dimension of EU migration policy for non-member states. And I think the big issue here, the relationship between internal and external policy in the European Union is mediated by the idea of solidarity between EU member states. An absence of solidarity or an effective absence of solidarity between EU member states has, I think, led to a greater emphasis on offloading or externalizing migration policy to non-member states. And so that's a kind of point about policy. My third point is about politics, and I think this is really crucial in the European Union, the kind of politics of migration. Immigration has been politicized in the European Union. By politicized, I mean it has been salient, so it's been an important topic of public debate, and it's also been, the debate has also been polarized between opponents of immigration and those who are more supportive of immigration. So that level of politicization, I think, has been an important dynamic in Europe. I would emphasize that that does not mean, I would emphasize this very strongly, that attitudes to migration in Europe have not become more negative. We do a lot of work on that here at the European University Institute. Over the last 20 years, attitudes to migration, to immigration from within and from outside the European Union have become more favorable in Europe, not more negative. It's a complete misunderstanding to imagine there's an increased anti-immigration sentiment in Europe. What there has been is increased attention to the issue and increased salience to the issue in public debate, not a change in attitudes in a more opposed way to immigration. What I think is important is there's a new dividing line in European politics. And that dividing line often centers around the understandings of the effects of globalization. People who are more favorable to globalization, people who are more opposed to globalization. And immigration and European integration have become associated with this important new dividing line in European politics, which is about the meaning and the effects of globalization. It's become quite contentious in European politics. I think that's a point about the politics of this in Europe, which is perhaps different from other regions because of the way that the EU is institutionalized by treaty with lawmaking powers and its own institutions. It's become much more of a contentious issue in European politics because of its presence as a political system in its own right with its own lawmaking powers, and those who are favorable to it and those who are opposed to it has created a new dividing line in European politics. And a final point is about, well, the future. What does all this mean? And I think if we want to think about, well, we can't predict the future, but what we can do is think about what the recent past might tell us about the future. And we can also see some imminent developments in the EU that might give us some signals. Now, an imminent development in Europe is a new compact on migration, which the European Commission is currently developing. And I think that is going to make further efforts to develop a common European response. Now, the response in Europe to this compact proposed by the Commission will be very important, because I think it will show to us either the opportunities for deeper regional integration or the limits to deeper regional integration. I think it's a key moment. It's not whether the EU itself will rise or fall. I think that would be exaggerating. But I think that we would see the potential limits of regionalism if the compact is unable to secure the support of member states, if they do not see a sufficient level of solidarity, or if we don't see a sufficient level of solidarity to support a greater role for the European Union in the area of migration and asylum policy. And as a very final point, I would argue that if we see limits to the regionalism, or limits to regionalism, then we will see limits to globalization, because I would argue that any attainment of global objectives depends fundamentally upon regions and the incorporation of global standards into regional norms, standards and practices. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. You know, I've actually learned something, and I will take this away, because I see you, I hear and see your commitment to what you're saying, and your conviction almost on this point that attitudes to immigration in Europe have not become more negative. Good, and I think then that leads us to perhaps also then rethink this discourse along those lines. If it has not become more negative, then and if it is about the politics within Europe, then how exactly do we change these issues? You know, I've heard a lot of leaders in the Gulf states say, we don't understand why Europe keeps talking to us about human rights when the conversations in Europe are also about only high-skilled migrants, while in the Gulf we give options for everybody, you know, whether you're high or low-skilled or professional or whatnot. And I think it's important for us to then reconcile these different views and values that we see coming from the different regional perspectives. But thanks so much for that, Andrew, and really taking us forward. I remember during the Global Compact for Migration negotiations, it was a tough discussion, particularly from within the European Union context itself, and of course now with Brexit. Okay, with all that said, you know, there are quite a few people here that I would like to call on. I noticed that Ambassador Nahida Soban is not with us at this moment. She may have had to leave. There are some questions from her, which I will raise perhaps to the others. But it's important to hear from a few other people. I'm thinking of Fatima Alfin from Comoros, who led their work in the negotiations for the African group in New York. Fatima, if you can hear me, here's a quick question for you, Fatima. And in 1 minute, literally, because I want to give it to a few other people and then come back to the panelists. But in 1 minute, what exactly has changed? I mean, Charles said that he can't speak for all of Africa. I'm curious to know, what was the African groups thinking during the GCM negotiations? And now that COVID has happened, it's only been a year and a half since we left New York and have had all that conversations and negotiations in New York. I'm wondering, are the member states in New York, are they taking this back on board? Is that really a part of the consideration and the thinking there? Fatima?
Yes, Shabri, thank you so much for the invitation, and I thank the organizers and all the panelists for the very insightful briefings. Thank you. Well, it's very interesting to raise that at the UN level today, when we look at the perspectives and what is happening, it seems like it's even like the global compact has never existed. And it's very sad to realize that we're sitting together, establishing that big framework. And at the end of the day, after 1.5 years and the pandemic that we are facing, all of us, it's not even mentioned. To take a few examples, right now we are negotiating a resolution on the response, a comprehensive response and coordination of the COVID. And there is not even one single mention of the Global Compact, because it's seen as let's say, controversial. We know that a group here, we have proposed a couple of paragraphs to highlight issues that migrants, workers, or also undocumented migrants are facing during the pandemic. Not to talk about the health workers, that most of them are migrants, not to talk about the issue of unemployment that many of you have raised before. Everything that was said, and even the issue of health, access to healthcare for migrants, none of those elements that we propose as Africa, and remittance as well, the problem of remittance, the Africa group here, we propose those to be included in that text that will be comprehensive. It's supposed to be comprehensive, and also with the issue of not leaving no one behind. Those elements were not even included in the text at this stage, and we are just almost about to finalize that text. So that's to say that it's very sad that we are far back to what we have achieved so far. But I'm very also relieved that it's not only the UN. I'm hearing that even at the regional level, at the international level still, and the push also we have the civil society, the role that civil society is playing, the issue of migration is not forgotten. So it's a big relief for me to hear that the work is still ongoing, despite the fact that the compact has been completely neglected. So I will. That's what I want to say.
No, thanks so much. It's actually, in fact, I don't think Rula's picture was gloomy, but it is gloomy when you say that in New York, perhaps that the Global Compact has been forgotten. And I really hope that is not the case. I really hope that this can be brought up. And thank you to the Africa Group for raising how you do it. 55 member states, when you come together, it's a huge force to reckon with. I hope that we can see similar such groupings come together in the context of Asia and Latin America. Not as easy, but perhaps something that we should also constantly focus on in terms of regional multilateralism. I know that Didar Singh is here. Sir, if you're online, just a quick remark from your side with regards to India and South Asia. You've also seen it from the employer's perspective. You've been the Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. I'm curious to know if you have any quick thoughts.
Left, I think.
He left? Okay. Didar Singh is left. I wanted to get the employer's perspective, but since he's left, I would still like to get the trade union perspective. And I wonder if Lakshman Basnath is still online. Lakshmanji?
Lakshmanji is there. Professor Margaret also is there.
Okay. Lakshmanji, please, 2 minutes, really. I mean, your quick thoughts on everything that right from Shahidul Haq and Pietro Mona to the others from the regional perspective have said.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good discussion, and I could learn a lot of things. And some of us are thinking, what is the discussion around the world, all over about the COVID-19 and migration? But I think it gives some food for thought. One thing I would say, we are talking about GCM in 2018, and it's non-binding. It's morally binding. Why should we worry if we cannot connect our own governments to come together to look after our own people of the South Asian. Who will look after our own people in South Asia? So in 2 minutes, I want to say what I'm trying to do, bring all the trade unions together and civil society together, an intellectual forum like this together to come out for the South Asian grouping of 8 countries together and look after the welfare of our own people in GCC countries, Malaysia, and within the South Asia also. Aren't we ashamed that a girl is bicycling her father for 2,800 kilometers? And we are not talking about that. That was a moral agreement signed by 152 countries in Marrakesh. That is the document which it will show our morality in our faces in South Asia. That what are we doing? And that document very specifically says that the regional negotiations are very important for the region. So should we not have a SAARC negotiation with the GCC countries? SAARC negotiation with Malaysia? That's all we are sending our people to. So I think it's about time that we have to think about what is the way forward. The way forward is all the sending country of a region should come together, the civil society group, the trade unions group, the intellectuals group for the ideas of discussions like this, and come to the point, and GCM has given 23 points very correctly, very elaborately, that what has to be done in every step. And let's ask for that our counterpart is GCC countries and Malaysia. Thank you very much, Shabri, for recognizing me.
Thank you. No, thank you, Lakshmanji. I think it's important. And you're right. It is morally binding, isn't it? If we have adopted it, it may not be a signature on a paper, but we have committed to it. And I think that is an important point that you make. I also recognize the presence of Binod Kadria. Sir, Binod, sir, if you're still around, it would be great to hear a couple of perspectives from your side. You have also been involved in the, as an editor for the World Migration Report 2020, and I'm sure this was not perhaps a conversation then when you were doing the report. So, how do we take this now?
Thank you, Sabri. Yes, indeed, it was not the conversation at that point in time, but something that was discussed in this session. I'm sorry that I missed the first 2 presenters. I was misled. I misled myself by thinking that it will start at 6:30. Fortunately, I joined just after 6, so I could have lost more. What I'm saying is that it rings a bell in the sense the discussion that took place at the second thematic debate on GCM at New York, that I was the thematic expert for that. And that's where I found that a lot of things were talked about in the sense of, multilateralism. But today, I would advocate for multilateralism. Probably we have done it at length for quite long period, and it's time perhaps for us to look into it in a more nuanced way, in terms of not stopping, with just beating around the bush with the same things again and again, and start living in a fool's paradise, that the world is flat, the world is equal. The world is not equal. When we are finding that the world is not equal, whether it's we look at the global level or the regional level, the differences are there, then we need to perhaps change the discourse. We have to get out of the stereotypes. And for that, the first step is to identify the stereotypes. What are the stereotypes? The stereotype is that we believe that the multilateralism of the kind that we have experimented for so long, more than half a century, has not taken us anywhere. So we need to qualify it. What kind of multilateralism? And I hear that people are actually mentioning these between the lines in terms of, there was a talk about mini multilateralism today. Our friend from Nepal Lakshmanji has said about South Asia. Then we heard Andrew Gaddis about the European Union coming together. So there are these multilateralism already taking place. And when we actually have interface between these mini multilateralism and at the global level, then the discourse will be completely different. And I call it the equitable adversary analysis, EAA. That is what we need to have. We have to put ourselves into the shoes of the adversary and try to look at the issue from the other side, because we cannot pretend that migration is just like, you know, exchange of commodities and like trade, like other kinds of flows. It is the flow of human beings where, as William has said, we need to have, you know, that kind of empathy that is missing now. And the COVID is reminding us of that empathy. So if we want to maintain that, bring in new blood into the discourse, then the dialogue has to change completely. And for that, we have to be brave enough to say that enough is enough. Other day, I was in this forum itself, I was attending the dialogues on the African continent. And again, we were saying the North-South cooperation, the South-South cooperation. I think we have talked about these cliches for long enough. We have to first come together ourselves, put our own house in order, and then talk about what kind of negotiations we can do by putting ourselves into the shoes of the other. Today, look at the unilateralism that is taking place around. Kuwait has stopped, has put a quota on people, foreigners, foreign workers, and Indians are hit hard very much. On the other hand, you look at United States, what is coming one after the other, H-1B, L-1, and then today is F-1 visa. The students are completely at disarray. If you are attending online, then you have to go home. So I think we are in a very, very uncertain world, and that's where we have to sit up and think together and say that what is old has to be given up, what is new, that has to be welcomed. Thank you.
No, absolutely, sir. I really appreciate you bringing in some of these elements. Thank you so much for that. This forum was supposed to be over 2 hours, and we are close to now the completion of it. There have been tens of questions, and I feel, again, if I have to go through each one of those questions, I may not be able to cover them all. So I'm actually going to turn it back to the panelists. I would have ideally liked to have the panelists also come back to some of the points that have been made here, Binod sir, by you and the others. You know, my worry is, Binod sir, I think empathy we don't even have for our own people. So how do we have for that foreigner? And we are particularly sitting in India, we're particularly seeing that now. So I think we need to start there first. But I want to turn back to the panelists. I'm not going to say how much time each panelist need to take. Technically, this session is supposed to be over in 7 minutes time. However, there are still 365 participants here listening to what everybody has to say, and very keenly. So I'm going to leave it to you, the panelists. I'm actually going to go backwards now, if I may. And I will leave Nicola for the last this time. So Nicola, bear with me. And the only reason is because you can, just as much as you have helped set the stage, I hope you will also be able to gift wrap it with all these ideas that we have received. So let's start the other way around. And let's start with Professor Andrew Gaddis. Andrew, please. Quick final thoughts from your side.
Well, I'm not quite sure in relation to what, to be honest. There's so many great points being made in the comments. I wouldn't know where to start. I don't know if there's anything particular you'd like me to address, because the chat function has gone quite crazy. There's so many great points being made. So unless you've seen anything particular, I'm very happy to cede my time to the panelists.
Okay, here's my point. Here's then something that's much more global and for you to consider. I know that one of the things that we've lacked in this conversation is a Latin American perspective, and that's always been important for us. The global conversations now also important for us to recognize the role of the emerging economies, BRICS, for instance. Where Brazil plays an important role, However, we see a whole range of other issues now happening in that context as well. The Venezuelan crisis, which is leading into this whole conversation on refugees and migrant workers. And we heard this from Ambassador Shahidul Haq as well. How do we not have a conversation that is holistic in nature, where we have to incorporate discussions around mixed migration, crisis migration, migrant workers, which is labor migration, and a whole range of other factors. So maybe something along those lines, also bringing in the Latin American perspective.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point, and we've just actually, it's good you should mention that. We just finished a 5-year project here at the EUI, where we've been looking or comparing regions, including South America with Europe, North America, and also with Southeast Asia. But I think that, to be very brief, a distinctive thing about South America is I think it offers some very interesting points of contrasts with other regionalisms. So we see quite ambitious provisions on protection and asylum and refugees in the Cartagena Convention. We also see the Mercosur, the Common Market of the South, where there are provisions on residence rights for nationals of the member states of Mercosur, the Common Market of the South. But I think, and what I would also say is what South America has offered is almost like a normative challenge to North American and European regionalism, much more progressive in the languages is used about mobility, migrants' rights to migrate, and migrant rights. So I think we can see, to put it very briefly, but other regionalisms are possible, and it is completely mistaken to imagine that European regionalism, which is born in very specific circumstances which were unique to Europe, is some kind of template or model. Regionalisms will always be very closely linked to the characteristics of the member states and their own, and the way that they understand their relations with their neighbours and their own identities as states. So I think perhaps South America helps us understand that point. I'll conclude there. Thank you, and thanks to all the other speakers and the participants.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew, for that. Okay, I then take it back to Charles. Charles, you heard about some of the perspectives that came from Fatima in New York, in terms of the African group conversations, and how difficult it has been to actually get this going in terms of a resolution on COVID, to actually incorporate migration-related elements there. So Africa is playing a strong role in pushing for these things. Charles, anything in particular? I know you also received quite a few comments and questions in the chat box based on the points that you made earlier. Anything in particular that you would like to conclude with?
Thanks, Shabari. Perhaps I may not have time to go through all the questions. I'll try and perhaps get the contacts and reach out to individuals bilaterally. But for me, what I would say is that for us to get out of it, it's until the last man gets out of it. Whether that last man would be the migrant, then the migrant has to be integrated into the response. Perhaps I'll just paraphrase the words of the WHO director, who says, "No one is safe until everyone is safe." So we will never get out of the pandemic until we all get out of the pandemic. Be it migrants, be it host communities, be it Europe, all regions in their totality. I'll stop there. And thanks for the opportunity, and to everyone.
No, thanks so much, Charles. Thanks for that. I like it. I think, and it resonates what you said now about the WHO Director General's point about, that we'll all have to be safe, and we can only be safe if everyone is really safe. And I think it is so important to recognize that, because that is also in line to what the Secretary General, the Director General of the ILO, for instance, have been talking about in terms of building back better. How do we build back better if there are a whole set of vulnerable populations that are left out? And here we're talking about migrants, but there are other groups such as migrant groups as well. Right, Rula, that brings me back to you now in the context of the Arab states. Any final points from your side?
No, I guess maybe just quickly to say, I think what my takeaway from this is, I think everybody kind of agrees that we do have the instrument. Is it perfect? Obviously it's not, but is it enough? I would say probably yes. I just think it's a question of recognizing the work that needs to go into the success or not of any instrument we have. So to me, it's largely a question of how do we get the implementation going.
Now, thanks so much, Rula. I agree with you. It is always a question of how do you get implementation going. But this is what I do. When the ILO works on fair recruitment and we work with governments on it, we say you're actually implementing Objective 6 of the GCM. When governments tell us about the importance of understanding the skills of migrant workers who are returning as a result of COVID, we say, well, you're actually addressing Objective 18 of the GCM. You're actually looking at Objective 21 on reintegration. You're actually thinking about creating jobs at home, which is decent work at home. That's Objective 2 of the GCM. You're looking at sharing information. That's Objective 1 of the GCM. So it's important for us to recognize also that sometimes, perhaps it is forgotten based on a negotiation in New York, but if we are there to also underline some of these elements constantly, then I don't think it is lost out. But that's again, the optimist in me constantly thinking that this does work and this will work. Coming back to the regional policy perspective with William. William, really now, I mean, you would have seen in the list of comments just so much, everybody just, constantly coming back to the dignity perspective that you laid out. I would still like to ask you, what is a lesson for Asia, William? What is it that we can take? Lakshman Basnet mentioned about some of these things for South Asia. What in particular do you think we need for Asia?
I think we would have to look at what is our shared reality. And Lakshman did talk about SAARC. And I think it's time we put the politics aside and we looked at what brings us together as a region. Whether it's ASEAN, whether it's SAARC, whether it's Colombo process, whether it's Abu Dhabi dialogue, the whole notion of interdependency as a region needs to have a transforming impact in our understanding. And I think that is something we have to look at when we come to the table of regionalisms. We are not independent states. We are neighbors coming together. And let's look at that.
No, absolutely. Thanks. Thanks, William. Coming back to Pietro. Pietro, you've heard all the regional perspectives now. Has that changed anything in your thinking? Some have been giving us, like Rula said, it was gloomy. Andrew speaks about the fact that migration is not really going in the negative direction, or the attitudes of people to migrants is not necessarily negative. We heard Charles talking about the fear of the foreigner, and William speaking about these issues in the context of Asia. I'm curious to hear from you now. How does this fit into your horizontal and vertical perspectives that you brought up right at the beginning?
Well, I'm and dare to say that it still fits perfectly in there, because I think what we and that this might sound a little bit arrogant if I say it that way, but I think what I heard is also that, I mean, the potential that is there, and yes, it hasn't been an easy path. It has never been. I mean, we've been working for 10 years now together, Shabri, and looking back at where we were 10 years ago, I mean, we were so excited to have 1-2 little sentences in the 2030 agenda. And now there is even more. There is a global compact, and does it have flaws? Yes. Has not every government, including myself, I have to be very open here, including my government, has not yet sort of signed up to the global compact. But all of this is also sort of to say, it's also to say these things, as unfortunate as it is, they take time. And yet, if you then go and start digging, as you just did before, you realize that a lot of things are actually happening. Each NGO, each grassroots organization that helps one domestic worker is doing that also. They may not know it, but it is also contributing to the ILO instruments, to the Global Compact, to the 2030 Agenda, and so on. And so I think this is also maybe, we also don't necessarily have to get too obsessed with these international documents, maybe. Ultimately, I think William said it in a different context, but it's also true in what I'm trying to say. Ultimately, is what it changes on the ground. How does it impact? Are we on the right path? And do we, if we are on the right path, honestly, I don't care that much if those who are on the right path do it with the knowledge that they are implementing the 2030 agenda, or they've never heard about the 2030 agenda. Obviously, it would be better if they do, but ultimately, I think we have to define a bit what we can do together. And I think this is also to some extent a translation from the global to the regional, to the national, to the local. I think we have to involve everybody in a continuous dialogue and showing, so what, learning from each other, listening to each other, also listening to the reality in South Asia, to what the reality is in the Horn of Africa. I know there are also some colleagues from Nigeria who are on this call. I think also this is also a dialogue that should happen, and it is from time to time frustrating because it takes so much time to change these systems. But again, I think there are ups and downs, but I honestly see there is an upward movement, and COVID has been a big hammer on our motivation, so to say, or it has taken down us a bit. But at the same time, we draw a lot of energy from rebuilding better, as you said, from building better, and sort of to step out of this crisis in a way that we can look back and say, we have not only suffered, but we've learned from it together, and we did it better. And if we need sources of inspiration, we have the documents, we have the instruments, we have ourselves to continue talking to each other and learning from each other. And so also what Andrew said about regionalism, of course, the European path is not necessarily the path that the Horn of Africa will go. They have to find their own way, but it is a pride of myself, and also I think of many of my colleagues, that we are working very closely with IGAD on migration issues, for example. Not because we know it better, but because we have a shared interest in doing things together. And I think this is and also again, we work very closely with the Nigerian government as well. So I think this is what keeps me going, when from time to time, I also get a little bit desperate that things are moving so slow at the macro level. But ultimately, I think further down, I think there's a lot of energy there. And all of you guys who have been stuck around for more than 2 hours now we are 340 people. I think all of you, this is just one tiny testament about the energy that is out there to learn, to listen, to talk, and then hopefully to implement on the ground. Thanks.
Oh, wow, Pietro, thanks so much for that inspiration. Really, really appreciate the perspectives that you bring forward. I will now, I've got my computer beeping. It's almost giving me some kind of a signal to say that, right, now time to hear from Shahidul Haq. Sir, where do we go from here?
Thank you very much. Let me put on record, Sabri, for a brilliant and exciting moderation. You have matured. I can see that, and congratulations for that.
Thank you, sir.
And also good to see many old friends after a long break. I will just I want to reiterate what I said, and I've reflected on it whole day actually. The migration shall never stop. So if politicians are thinking, if a particular state is thinking that we are not going to go out and no one will come in, then it's a fool's paradise. So that's the basic assumption. The question is, the pandemic has exposed and shaken everything, including our own value system, and certainly market and globalization. But it has also shaken the state. It has shaken quite heavily, actually, the state. And the question is how state will reform itself, how it will sort of behave in future. That's very important, because migration continue to remain a sovereign issue, and it's a state-centric discussion. Let me put it in a very blunt manner. And I know what it means, because I have represented a state, and we have gone through ups and downs in our policy, especially dealing with the Rohingyas. How much international obligations and how much national sovereignty, and how you make your own people happy, and at the same time UN not go bazaar. So that's one. So how state will reform is very important, that we need to see. Now, I'll just give you one example in this context. I sit in the Migrant Workers Committee. Very strangely, for the first time, a state has given a 3-pager as to how they are behaving or dealing with migrants in a pandemic situation. And this state is Singapore. As you know, Singapore excluded from their initial response all migrants, and they realized that's a great equalizer. It doesn't differentiate between a citizen and a non-citizen. So they have turned around and putting all together a response. Not only that, they went to the Migrant Workers Committee, which normally is not their domain. They're not a party to it, and given a 3-pager saying that this is what we have done, and please let us know if there's anything else we could do. So that's also a strange thing that we have noticed. So at least this is something very encouraging. I hope the other countries also come forth who has not signed the Migrant Workers Convention. So that's one. Now, comes back to the Asia. There's a lot of talk at the geopolitical level that Asia is going to lead the world. When nobody knows, hopefully the pandemic will accelerate it, and some of the other leaders are abandoning their leadership, so it will be easier for Asia. Now, Asia has to also then reflect on some of the fundamental humanitarian issues, which it hasn't. Because if you look at Europe and the America, they have actually been leading the debate in post-World War, even before that. So people knew how they're going to have their position on both the humanitarian issue and migration issue. But come to Asia, we are not sure, why SAARC fails to address it, and we all know. I have dealt with the issue as a foreign secretary, sitting in the SAARC, and also as an IOM regional rep for South Asia. So that I think the Asian states need to also collect their collective responsibility. How soon they will do it, we don't know. But we have seen some of the bigger players in Asia, including China, who has turned around and has become the leader in the globalization area, and also in the trade and services area, which they thought WTO is a useless organization till very recently. So change can happen. Now, whether pandemic that will bring the change or not, that need to see. But a smart state will emerge out of it. State will also revisit their behavior and function. That's where the hope lies. Now, the question is, and let me reiterate, that we need a dialogue, whether it starts with Asia, South Asia, or globally, that we can work out. But dialogue is extremely important, because when situation is very, when your house is burning and you have to build your house, you need ideas. And that idea has to be generated out of a dialogue. Thank you.
Sometimes, sir, there's no need to reiterate certain perspectives. So thank you for that. I can only underline it and italicize it and put it in bold, everything that you've said. Thank you for that. Nicola, where's the gift trap, Nicola? How do we gift wrap this conversation?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been an enormously informative session. I have learned so much. I mean, I've scribbled away like crazy, and it's really kind of hard to put it all together in one kind of sort of last message. But I guess what we have learned here is we have on one level really a sound, fantastic framework. The problem is the political and institutional challenges. And what kind of keeps ringing in my ear is a sentence, Fatima and Rula said, this thing about, keeping the momentum going. How do we keep the momentum going? The GCM is beginning to be forgotten, the SDGs, and so forth and so forth. And various speakers have come back to this issue of leadership, how important leadership here is, the building and nurturing of leadership, and not just government and state, beyond. We have heard about non-traditional actors, and not just the private sector, civil society, and so forth. So this idea of leadership. In terms of a little bit of hope, because I know I also started off by saying, we have a dysfunctional global migration governance system. But given that one of the big lessons COVID has kind of shown, this thing about the disruption of global supply, food and care systems and chains, and how important, you know, the role of migrants is, but also the importance around universal healthcare. You know, the economy, because sadly, a lot is driven in our everyday life by the economy, and the economy needs healthy workers. And as we know, the virus moves with people. So I actually have a glimmer of hope as far as at least in some sort of universal healthcare is concerned. And I'm sort of hoping that from that lesson, this will trigger more. It will actually show the world, we can do this. We can do this universal system approach thing if we start with this universal health. So this is sort of my hope.
No, I'm glad, and it's always good to finish off with a hope that is also universal in nature. No, thanks so much, Nicola. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that we don't leave here with gloom and doom as perspectives, but really talk about the hope. And I go back to the points that were made by everybody. But I'm also very taken in by the way Pietro put it, Nicola. For all of us here, all of us engaged here, and I've learned from all of you. You know, over the many years, we've seen developments. It's not happened overnight. I mean, we're talking about 3 months of COVID. Well, we've also seen how things developed from 2006 after the first high-level dialogue to where we are now. You know, and people like Shahidul Haq and William and Pietro have been really at the forefront of these conversations at the policy level. Anyways, with that, thank you so much. I mean, all I can say is we still have 325 participants on board. So thank you so much for all the time. It's 2 hours and 16 minutes since we started this conversation. I am so grateful. I am very enriched. And I really hope then to take on that one point that William made is whether this conversation will really contribute to migrant workers at their level, go down to their level, and then to going back to what Shahidul Haq said, can we continue the dialogue? Because we need ideas. So this has been a very important forum for those ideas. With that, I'd like to give the floor back to, I think it's Dr. Ruchi from the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me with Migrant Forum Asia, CCRM, and GRFDT for organizing this.
Ruchi, are you there? Ruchi, kindly unmute. Hello.
Hello. I'm extremely sorry. I got some network disconnection. I'm extremely sorry for the delay. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. It is a matter of immense pleasure for me to propose the formal vote of thanks for the 11th virtual panel discussion. Mr. Shabri, I must congratulate you for moderating the session so well. You kept us so engaged throughout the session and we never missed anything, and you moderated it so beautifully and wonderfully. Thank you for that. It indeed was very insightful and thought-provoking panel discussion, and it has enriched our knowledge in the mentioned topic, global and regional migration governments during COVID-19 pandemic. I offer my heartfelt thanks to the eminent and distinguished speaker for sharing their knowledge and their experience with us and sparing time from their busy schedule. I'm sure the valuable insights and observations shared by the distinguished speakers and eminent participants have helped us a lot in widening the domain of our knowledge. I'm personally thankful and grateful to the speakers, Professor Nicola Piper, Professor Andrew Hamati, Mr. Charles Ovila, Ambassador Pietro Bona, Mr. Shahidul Haq, Mr. William Goes for sharing their insightful session, and it indeed was great hearing to all of you. I'm again congratulating you, Mr. Sabri, for moderating the session so beautifully. You actually kept us, full of energy and life throughout filled it with the energy and, full of life throughout the session. Very, very thank you. And I pay heartful and grateful thank to you as well. I would also like to thank to some of the eminent participants who spared, time from their busy schedule and shared their thoughts. I'm like Professor Binod Khadaria sir, it's always such a wonderful delight to hear you. Professor Margaret, Dr. Didar Singh, who left at the end, but he was there, and Mr. V.K. Thomas, Fatima Alfan ma'am, Mr. Lakshmi Basanji, it was pleasure listening you, Mr. Kuntia, Mr. Elena Samay, and all other participants of whose name I have missed somehow. It was indeed pleasure being you all on the board on this wonderful session. A special thank to all the participants across the world who, despite of the time limitations, have managed to be the part of the entire session. Still, we have 302 participants. So huge kudos to all the participants. It's your spirit and encouragement which keeps us going. I'm also grateful to the organizing team, GRFDT, MFA, and CCRM for organizing such wonderful webinars and seminars and enriching our thought process in this lockdown period. Nothing could be more better than gaining lots of information and insights from such wonderful people across the globe and just in a screen. Sharing screen with you all is nothing less than dream kind of come true. I would also like to thank again, special thanks to the organizing team, Migrant Forum, GRB and CCRM. Thank you for the organizing this webinars. Special thank to management and support team who is actually behind the screen, who is letting this happen, which without their hard work and rigorous continuous support, this couldn't have been possible. So special thanks to them as well. And now I would also like to inform you all that the 12th panel discussion we'll be having on 14 July, Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. IST. The topic of the virtual panel discussion series 12 is Diplomatic Response to Migrants during COVID-19. Eagerly looking for more participation, as always, from all the participants. The link will be provided. Do register for the 12th virtual panel discussion series. And thank you all again for being there. And thank you, Dr. Sadanan sir, for giving me this opportunity to be, it's like pleasure for me and honor for me to formally propose the vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruchi Singh, and it is very great to hear that we, in a short notice, you could give the vote of thanks. And bye-bye to everybody. See you on 14th July.
Thank you, sir. Bye.